On one side of the world, the United States dollar has stood as the uncontested king of global finance for nearly 80 years. On the other, the Chinese yuan has emerged from the shadows of economic isolation to challenge that throne. This is not a story of military might or ideological speeches. This is the story of a financial Cold War that is quietly reshaping the rules of the global economy, while most of us go about our daily lives, unaware that the ground beneath our feet is shifting. In 1978, China's entire economy was worth roughly $150 billion. By 2024, that figure had grown to 18 trillion. To put that in perspective, China accomplished in 4 decades what took the West nearly 2 centuries. The speed of this transformation is unprecedented in human history, and it has created a collision course between the world's largest economy and its fastest-growing rival. The United States built the financial architecture that governs international trade, lending, and investment. China now has the resources and the ambition to rewrite it. What happens when these two giants can no longer coexist under the same economic system? What happens when both refuse to back down? This is a new kind of war, one fought not with missiles and tanks, but with currency manipulation, trade routes, technology monopolies, and the silent leveraging of debt. And unlike the last Cold War, which ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, this one will not be decided by which side has more nuclear warheads. It will be decided by who controls the flow of money, the infrastructure of the future, and the resources that power modern civilization. The outcome will determine whose rules govern the global economy for the next century. And unlike the last Cold War, this one will decide who controls your money. The story begins in 1944, in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where representatives from 44 nations gathered to rebuild the global financial system from the ruins of World War II. The United States emerged with something no empire in history had ever possessed: the power to print the world's reserve currency. The Bretton Woods Agreement tied global trade to the US dollar, which was backed by gold. Even after the gold standard collapsed in 1971, the dollar retained its dominance. Oil was priced in dollars. International debts were settled in dollars. Central banks hoarded dollars as their primary reserve. For decades, this arrangement gave the United States an unparalleled economic advantage, allowing it to borrow cheaply, impose sanctions with devastating effect, and shape the rules of international commerce. But while the United States enjoyed its post-war supremacy, China was collapsing inward. The country had spent decades isolated under Mao Zedong's policies, its economy stagnant and its people impoverished. Then, in 1978, Deng Xiaoping took control and made a decision that would alter the course of history. He opened China to the world. Deng's reforms allowed private enterprise, welcomed foreign investment, and created special economic zones where capitalism could flourish within a communist framework. The results were immediate and staggering. Factories sprang up across coastal cities. Foreign companies rushed in to take advantage of cheap labor and low production costs. China's economy began to grow at double-digit rates, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. The turning point came in 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization. The West believed it had one. The thinking was simple: integrate China into the global economy, and it would gradually adopt Western values, liberalize its politics, and become a cooperative partner. Instead, China took full advantage of the access it had been granted. It became the world's factory, producing everything from electronics to steel at a scale and speed no nation had ever achieved. American companies outsourced their manufacturing to Chinese factories. The trade imbalance grew wider every year, but Western consumers enjoyed cheaper prices and Western corporations enjoyed higher profits. So the arrangement continued. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis exposed the fragility of the American-led system. Major banks collapsed, housing markets crashed. The United States was forced to bail out its financial institutions while millions of Americans lost their homes and savings. China, by contrast, emerged largely unscathed. Its government had maintained tight control over its banking system and had accumulated nearly $4 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. While the United States struggled to recover, China seized the opportunity to expand its influence. In 2013, President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, a $1 trillion infrastructure program that would eventually span more than 150 countries. China would finance the construction of ports, railways, highways, and power plants in developing nations, creating new trade routes and deepening economic ties. The initiative was framed as mutual development, but the strategic intent was clear. China was building the infrastructure of a new global order, one in which it would sit at the center. By 2020, the power balance had shifted, and both sides knew it. The US dollar remains the dominant force in global finance, accounting for roughly 59% of all foreign exchange reserves held by central banks worldwide. But this dominance is not merely a matter of preference, it is a weapon. When the United States imposes sanctions on a nation, it is effectively cutting that country off from the global financial system. Russia learned this after its annexation of Crimea. Iran learned it when its nuclear program drew international scrutiny. These sanctions work because most international transactions, even those between two non-American parties, are settled in dollars and processed through American financial institutions. This gives the United States the power to monitor, freeze, or block payments anywhere in the world. It is economic warfare that requires no troops, no missiles, and no visible confrontation. China has watched this system with growing concern and growing resolve. For years, Beijing has worked to internationalize the yuan, promoting its use in trade agreements and encouraging other nations to hold it as part of their reserves. Progress was slow at first, but in 2022, China achieved a breakthrough. Saudi Arabia, America's oldest ally in the Middle East, agreed to accept payment for oil in yuan. This was not symbolic. Oil is the most traded commodity on the planet, and for decades it has been priced exclusively in dollars, a system known as the petrodollar. By breaking that monopoly, China demonstrated that alternatives to dollar dominance are not only possible but increasingly attractive to nations. Weary of American influence, at the same time, China has been pioneering a new frontier in currency altogether. In 2020, it launched the digital yuan, the world's first central bank digital currency deployed at scale. By 2024, more than 260 million people were using it. Unlike cryptocurrencies, which operate outside government control, the digital yuan is issued and monitored by the Chinese state. Every transaction is traceable. This gives Beijing unprecedented surveillance capabilities and the ability to control the flow of money within its borders with precision. It also offers China a way to bypass the international banking system entirely, making American sanctions far less effective. The United States has been slower to respond, but it is responding. Regulators have begun drafting rules for stablecoins, digital currencies pegged to the dollar. The Federal Reserve has launched FedNow, a system designed to enable instant payments. And discussions about a potential digital dollar have moved from theoretical to serious policy consideration. The stakes are clear. If China's digital currency becomes the standard for international trade, the United States risks losing the financial surveillance and sanctions power it has relied on for decades. Beyond currency, there is the quieter but equally potent weapon of debt. China holds roughly $850 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds, making it one of America's largest creditors. But the real power of debt lies in the developing world, where China has deployed its Belt and Road loans with strategic precision. When nations struggle to repay, China gains influence. In some cases, it has taken control of the assets it financed, from ports to power grids, effectively turning debt into long-term strategic footholds. The battlefield of currency and debt is vast and complex. Both nations are maneuvering for advantage, testing the limits of the other's power, and searching for vulnerabilities to exploit. But currency is just one front. The real war is being fought in technology. At the heart of every smartphone, every data center, every weapon system, and every artificial intelligence model is a semiconductor chip. These tiny pieces of silicon are the foundation of the modern world, and the majority of the most advanced chips on the planet are manufactured in a single place, Taiwan. The island produces roughly 90% of the world's cutting-edge semiconductors, a concentration of production that has turned it into one of the most strategically vital pieces of territory on Earth. Both the United States and China understand that control over semiconductor manufacturing is not just an economic advantage. It is a matter of national security. The United States has responded to this vulnerability with the CHIPS and Science Act. a $52 billion investment designed to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to American soil. The goal is to reduce dependence on Taiwan and ensure that if geopolitical tensions escalate, the U.S. will still have access to the chips that power everything from fighter jets to consumer electronics. Companies like Intel and TSMC have announced plans to build fabrication plants in Arizona and Ohio. But these facilities will take years to construct and even longer to reach full production capacity. In the meantime, the dependence remains. China has pursued a different path, locked out of the most advanced Western chip-making technology by export controls. Beijing has poured more than $150 billion into developing its own domestic semiconductor industry. Chinese companies like SMIC have made significant progress, advancing from producing chips that were generations behind to manufacturing semiconductors that are closing the gap. These efforts have been hampered by sanctions that prevent China from acquiring the specialized equipment needed to produce the most cutting-edge chips, but the trajectory is clear. China is willing to invest whatever it takes to achieve self-sufficiency. The competition extends beyond semiconductors to the infrastructure that will define the next generation of communication. Fifth-generation wireless networks, or 5G, are faster and more reliable than anything that came before. China's Huawei became the world leader in 5G technology, deploying its equipment in more than 70 countries. The United States responded with a diplomatic pressure campaign, urging allies to ban Huawei from their networks on the grounds that the equipment could be used for espionage. Some nations complied, others did not. The result is a fractured global communications infrastructure. Artificial intelligence represents the third front in this technological arms race. The United States currently leads in the development of large language models and generative AI, but China has focused its efforts on surveillance. Chinese cities are blanketed with more than 600 million cameras equipped with facial recognition technology, creating a monitoring system that can track individuals in real time. The United States has attempted to slow China's progress by imposing export controls on advanced technology, blocking companies like NVIDIA from selling their most powerful processors to Chinese customers. These controls have had an impact, but they have also accelerated China's determination to develop its own alternatives. Whoever controls the technology controls the economy. But technology needs resources. Beneath the surface of every technological advancement lies a more fundamental struggle: the competition for the raw materials that make modern life possible. Rare earth minerals are essential to the production of smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, missile guidance systems, and virtually every piece of advanced electronics in use today. China controls roughly 70% of the global supply of rare earth minerals, not because it has more deposits than other nations, but because it invested heavily in the mining and processing infrastructure decades ago, while the rest of the world looked the other way. The United States imports approximately 80% of its rare earths from China, a dependency that has created a profound strategic vulnerability. If China were to restrict exports of these materials, American manufacturers would struggle to produce everything from consumer electronics to military equipment. This is not hypothetical. In 2010, China briefly halted rare earth exports to Japan during a territorial dispute, demonstrating its willingness to use resource access as a political weapon. Energy represents another dimension of this resource competition. China has become the world's largest importer of oil. And to secure its energy future, Beijing has invested heavily in oil-producing regions, particularly in Africa and the Middle East. Chinese state-owned companies have taken stakes in oil fields, refineries, and pipelines across multiple continents, building relationships with governments that were previously aligned with Western interests. The United States has recognized the danger of these dependencies and has begun pursuing a strategy of onshoring and friendshoring, bringing critical manufacturing back to American soil or relocating it to allied nations. Corporate giants have started to respond. Apple, once entirely reliant on Chinese manufacturing, has begun moving production to India and Vietnam. China has not taken this quietly. In 2023, it imposed export controls on gallium and germanium, two metals critical to semiconductor production and military applications. The irony is that both nations are deeply intertwined in ways that make complete separation extraordinarily difficult. American companies depend on Chinese manufacturing and rare earth processing. Chinese companies depend on American technology and market access. Yet both governments are committed to reducing their vulnerabilities, even if it means accepting inefficiency and higher prices in the short term. The question is no longer who's stronger, it's who can survive without the other. The competition between the United States and China is not confined to their own borders. Much of the contest is playing out in the developing world, where nations are making calculations about which side offers the better path forward. Africa has become one of the most contested regions in this struggle. China has committed more than $160 billion in infrastructure loans to African nations over the past 2 decades, financing the construction of railways, highways, ports, and telecommunications networks across the continent. These projects have transformed cities and connected regions that were previously isolated. The United States has taken a different approach, focusing on direct aid, health programs, and military partnerships. But when an African leader looks at what each power is offering, the choice is not always straightforward. China brings infrastructure and asks few questions about governance or human rights. The United States brings expertise and military support, but often attaches conditions related to democratic reform and transparency. For nations in need of immediate economic development, China's model has proven appealing. Latin America tells a similar story. China has quietly become the top trading partner for Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. Chinese investment has flowed into mining, agriculture, and energy sectors, areas where American companies once dominated. China buys soybeans, copper, and oil in massive quantities, providing a reliable market for commodities that drive these economies. Southeast Asia represents perhaps the most critical battleground. In 2020, China led the creation of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a trade bloc that encompasses 15 countries and more than 2 billion people, making it the largest free trade agreement in history. The United States has responded with its own Indo-Pacific economic framework, but the framework lacks the concrete benefits of a traditional trade agreement. And many Southeast Asian nations remain skeptical about whether American commitments will outlast changes in political leadership. Critics point to cases like Sri Lanka, which in 2017 was forced to hand over control of a strategically important port to a Chinese, state-owned company after defaulting on its loan payments. These examples are held up as evidence of a deliberate debt trap strategy. Chinese officials reject this characterization, arguing that their loans are offered on fair terms and that financial difficulties stem from poor governance and external economic shocks rather than predatory lending. What is clear is that the developing world is no longer content to simply align with one power or the other based on Cold War loyalties. These nations are weighing their options, playing both sides when possible, and making pragmatic decisions based on their own interests. Every nation is being forced to choose, and that choice will reshape the world order. The trajectory of this financial Cold War is not predetermined. There are multiple paths forward, each with its own consequences. The first scenario is full decoupling, a world in which the United States and China operate as 2 separate economic systems with minimal interaction. Supply chains are reorganized along geopolitical lines. Trade between the 2 blocs shrinks to near zero. Financial systems diverge, with the dollar dominating one half of the world and the yuan anchoring the other. This scenario offers both nations security and independence, but it comes at a steep price. Efficiency declines, innovation slows, costs rise. The global economy would have to be rebuilt from the ground up, resulting in slower growth and reduced living standards. The second scenario is uneasy coexistence, a world in which the United States and China continue to compete fiercely in some areas while cooperating selectively in others. Climate change might be one area where cooperation proves necessary. Trade would continue, but under more restrictive conditions, with each side protecting its most sensitive industries. This is perhaps the most likely outcome, though it is also the most unstable. It requires both nations to exercise restraint and to manage crises without allowing them to spiral into broader confrontations. The third scenario is conflict escalation, a path that begins with a single miscalculation and ends in catastrophe. The flashpoint could be Taiwan, the island that both produces the world's most advanced semiconductors and remains a core issue of Chinese sovereignty. If China were to invade, the United States would face an impossible choice: intervene militarily and risk a war between nuclear powers, or stand aside and watch the global balance of power shift decisively. Either choice would have profound economic consequences. Neither government is likely to reverse course. Both see the competition as existential, a matter of national survival, rather than a policy choice that can be revisited. The momentum behind decoupling is powerful, driven by strategic fears that have deep roots in both capitals. The question becomes not whether this financial Cold War will continue, but how long it can be sustained and at what cost. The choices being made today will determine the economic reality for billions of people for decades to come.